Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I'm going to be doing a new type of video, a new segment, I guess, on the channel that I may do some more of in the future. And that is top 5 reasons why I love a given author or series. And today I'm going to be doing 5 reasons why I love Brandon Sanderson. So those of you who have been watching my channel for a bit probably know by now Brandon Sanderson is one of, if not my favorite author at the moment. Granted, there's a ton of stuff out there that I haven't read, even within fantasy. There's so many authors and series out there that are loved by many that I have not read. But right now, Brandon Sanderson is my favorite of the bunch. I have read around a dozen of his books. I haven't read everything yet, but I have read the vast majority of his Cosmere. I haven't read any of his non-Cosmere work yet, so this video will be primarily focused on the Cosmere. But I've read a bunch of his stuff. I've read the Mistborn trilogy. I've read all 3 of his standalones that have come out in the Cosmere. I've read the first couple books of Stormlight Archive, all that stuff. I've read most of the Wax and Wayne books. So I've read quite a bit of his work, and I have loved everything that I have read so far. And so in this video, I'm going to be talking about why I really like him. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about when it comes to why I love Brandon Sanderson is one of the most important aspects of books and storytelling in general to me, and that's his characters. I really love a lot of the characters that Brandon writes. Many of them are among my favorite fictional characters of all time, and the journeys that they go on are just incredible. You have something like the original Mistborn trilogy with Vin, who is kind of the main protagonist of that trilogy, and she's a great character, and she goes through a really great arc throughout that, alongside other characters like Elend and Sazed, who go through great arcs in that trilogy, and they're characters that I love. Then you have Stormlight Archive, which, like I said, I've only read 2 books of so far. I've only read the first 2. But even then, like, Kaladin, for me, is probably in my top 5 fictional characters of all time. I love Kaladin, especially in the first book, but second book, he's also fantastic. And there's just so many emotional moments for me where, things would happen with him and it just really resonated with me. And then there's other characters in that, like Dalinar and Adolin and Shallan and Yasna, and several other characters, even some of the more side characters, like some of the people in Bridge 4, or Seth, who's kind of mostly appeared in the interludes and some other scenes here and there, but he's not a main character at the point in the series that I'm at. But he's great, and there's just so many great characters that are memorable and interesting, and they feel like they could be real people. They're not just characters that are there to fulfill a stereotype or something like that. They feel like they're well-rounded, well-developed, fleshed out characters that feel like they could be real people. And there's just so many great ones, even going into some of the other stuff that I haven't mentioned, like the standalones, Tress of the Emerald Sea and Warbreaker, even Elantris, which I consider to be his weakest book. Even that has some really good character stuff. So first thing I love is his characters. The second thing that I love about Brandon Sanderson's books is another thing that I feel very important, that I feel is very important when it comes to storytelling, especially within fantasy and adjacent genres, and that is the world building. I love also the world building in Brandon's books. He just comes up with such vivid and interesting worlds that are unique and interesting to learn about. I'll use the example again of Stormlight Archive because I'm only 2 books in out of the 4 that are currently out, and there's just so much interesting stuff that you learn about that world of Roshar, between the magic system, which I'm not going to be mentioning as its own point because I'm lumping it in with world building, but his magic systems are really cool as well. But just the magic that you learn about, the wildlife, the customs of the people that live there, the landscape that you get is very cool and unique. And there are still plenty of mysteries left, things that you don't know about the backstory of the world, things that are just different world building things that, he kind of hints at but doesn't really tell you about until later on. And same thing happens in Mistborn as well. And it's just, his world building is so great. So many of the worlds that he has made are some of my favorites in fiction. Again, Roshar from Stormlight Archive, Scadrial from Mistborn, which I love what he's doing with Scadrial as well, because Mistborn is split into multiple different eras. I believe there's going to be 4 or 5 of them, and they all take place in different time periods. So right now, only the first 2 eras are out, but the first one's kind of more typical fantasy-ish, and then the second one is kind of late 1800s, early 1900s, kind of setting, that's kind of the real world comparison. And it's great to see, this one same world that has these fantasy elements, growing and changing over time and all that stuff. And again, his other worlds, Tress of the Emerald Sea, his, at this time, most recent Cosmere book, has some really interesting world building to it that I loved, with the way that the oceans worked and all that stuff. And his world building in general is just so fantastic and so interesting, and I could just like keep learning about it and just still want to keep knowing more. And I'm excited to keep going and, learn even more as I keep reading his books. The third thing that I want to talk about, and this is kind of the last thing really about his books, the last 2 things I have to talk about are more about what he's doing in general. But the third thing that I want to talk about is actually his writing style, his prose. Brandon Sanderson's writing style is something that actually gets a decent amount of criticism. His prose is meant to be very simple, very easy to read, something that just kind of gets the point across to you and then kind of gets out of the way, which is something that's been criticized by a lot of people, and understandably so, because it's not, super flowery prose, it's not super beautifully written or anything like that, but I really love his writing style, and I would consider his writing style to be among my favorites, because I just really enjoy an author who, first of all, has a style that they can do really well, but also, I like that he is just, gets things across very clearly and very easily, while still having plenty of sections of his writing that are very well written and very memorable. That's something that I value, is being able to read something and easily comprehend and understand it without having to, do that extra mental work kind of to take what is being written and kind of interpret it into something that's easier for me to kind of understand, if that makes sense. So I was editing this video the next day after I recorded it, and I thought of something else I wanted to bring up in regards to Sanderson's prose. And one thing that I also really appreciate about it in terms of its simplicity is the fact that it makes it, easier to read, but it's also like makes it much quicker for me to read, which, given that I like to read a lot of different books and stuff like that, and I like to kind of get through things at a good pace, being able to just easily understand something and be able to get through it that much a little bit quicker, is decently important to me. And of course that also depends on like the pace that you read at and all that stuff. But that's another thing that, kind of branches off from this that I like, is that because it's so easy to understand and comprehend, I can just kind of move through his books a lot easier and a lot quicker without having to kind of stop and really try to think more about what he's actually saying, which is the case for some other authors who tend to have more flowery prose or more complex prose. When I think of some other authors like Tolkien, or another example that I would give for this that's not really flowery prose, but it's kind of more complex prose, is something like H.P. Lovecraft, who I also love. With them, their prose is a little bit less accessible. It's a little harder to, read it and really easily get, what's going on. Whereas with Brandon Sanderson is kind of the opposite of that. And even though, he doesn't have the most beautiful prose in the world, I still really appreciate his style that he has. My fourth thing that I'm going to talk about is the interconnectivity of his stories. Now, this is not something that I'm going to talk about a huge amount, because I would consider parts of the ways that his stories are interconnected to be spoilers, essentially. And I don't want to spoil his books, just in case you happen to be watching this and you haven't read any of his books and you're just interested in seeing, some reasons why I think you should read his stuff. So I'm not going to be getting super into that. But Brandon Sanderson, a lot of his books take place within the Cosmere, which is his interconnected universe of fantasy stories. And so you have different series or standalones taking place on different worlds, and then things from those worlds will cross over with each other. So you might get references to one world or one book in a completely different series, or something like that, or you might have characters pop up between them. The most obvious and popular example of this, and this is not really a spoiler, because it's very well known within his books, but there's a character named Hoyd who jumps between worlds and jumps between books, and he appears in most of the Cosmere books. And at the moment, no spoilers in the comments or anything, both for my sake and for the sake of others, but I, at the moment, don't really understand how that works. But it's really intriguing to me because there is that crossover, and having, different things being referenced in different books. Again, not to really spoil things, but Tress of the Emerald Sea, his newest book, there were a lot of parts where I was like, okay, I can understand where that reference is and that reference is and stuff like that. And other books of his have done stuff like that as well. So I love the interconnectivity of his books. It is not essential to read everything that he has written. I think if you just have this one particular series that you especially love, I don't think you have to read everything else. But I think that, reading all the other stuff really kind of makes it a more enjoyable experience, and kind of, it's a lot of little, things that you'll pick up on that just make the worlds feel more deep and interesting and all of that stuff. Now, the final thing that I have to talk about with Brandon Sanderson's books, again, kind of talking more about the wider Cosmere as opposed to, stuff about his actual writing and his books, is the scale of it, which is kind of similar to the interconnectivity, but I kind of separate them in my mind. I love storytelling on a big scale. I don't think that is absolutely necessary to have an interesting story. There are plenty of stories out there that, are not very large scale, but I think are still really cool. But something that I really appreciate being done well within storytelling, and something that I really enjoy seeing in storytelling, is something that is just really big, really ambitious, and just has a very large sense of scale to it. You get that with some of the other stuff that I love, like Star Wars, for example. You have stories spanning across thousands of years, or, the movies taking place over such a long period of time and telling this one big story, or you have other things like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which kind of does a similar thing to the Cosmere, but in movie form. Brandon has compared his books to the MCU multiple times. So, big, huge scale stories like that are just super interesting to me, and it's very ambitious as well, which, regardless of whether it is done perfectly, I can always appreciate something that's very ambitious and maybe doesn't quite stick the landing 100%, but you can see the passion there and the excitement about making something so big and ambitious. And the Cosmere is very ambitious. He has all these big series planned that are all going to cross over with each other and all this stuff and make this big interconnected universe. And I just think that is super cool. But anyways, that is pretty much all I've got for this video. 5 things about Brandon Sanderson, and more specifically his Cosmere, but Brandon Sanderson that I really love. So, whether you're a fan of his books or whether you're someone looking to get into his books and you're just curious what I love about him, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know down in the comments if you have read Brandon Sanderson, if you agree with any of my points or disagree with any of my points, or if you have any particular things that you really enjoy about his books that I did not mention. And also, if you have any suggestions for more videos like this for me to do, if you'd like me to do, 5 reasons why I love a particular series or whatever that you would be interested in that I have read before, or that I've covered on the channel or whatever, let me know that down in the comments as well. I'm always open to suggestions. And that is pretty much it for this video. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys next time.